We're going to close the presentation and switching the nature of the discussion to something that I think is crucial right now, given the kind of crisis that we're in. Yes, there's an economic crisis, there's a financial crisis, there's a lot of crises, if you go to Africa, if you go in many different places, there's wars. And there's also an unseen crisis, right? And this is the tendency where people tend to react to what they can see, which they, more often than not, as I'm sure JP may have touched on this, believe is actually the cause of their misère and all the problems, right? Where we have these austerity protests, right? We have these protests against war and all that, which are noble things in and themselves. But the question is, how do we actually change the system which creates these problems? Is that even the case? Is there something higher which we should actually be paying attention to, that without that, we are actually going to be impotent in the face of all these different crises that are coming at us like a thousand-headed hydra, and people are like, oh my God, it's too complicated, it's too hard, there's nothing you can do. That's not true. But that's why I want to get at a completely unpractical question, the question that is on virtually nobody's mind right now, that is actually the fundamental question, that if we can actually resolve this in people, we can actually talk about the real problem and solve it. But if you look at the world today, with all the insanity and chaos, the culture, the satanic culture, frankly, we're going to have to create new institutions in order to do what we need to do, which I think Avneet, JP may have presented in some form. We're going to have to create new institutions based on a new concept of man. And that's actually the issue. What is the conception of a human being which we need right now if we're actually going to shape and make policy, as has always been the purpose and basis of this organization? And so that's why I want to speak to you guys about art. And so here we have a famous passage from Schiller's very epic, great poem, The Artist, where he says, "The dignity of man into your hands is given. Its keeper be. It sinks with you it will be risen." And he's referring to art, that art is really the keeper of man. So I tell a story first. I had the fortune of going to France in 2012 to work with our organization there for the presidential campaign. Jacques Cheminade in France was our presidential campaign. And one thing that struck me that you don't see here, that people here in North America really have no inkling of, is when you look at some of the architecture, just average houses, just you go down average streets, and it's just beautiful. It's beautiful, it's very beautiful. And there's a certain feeling that I was hit with when you're looking at this and you're just seeing, this is a good example, this is very extravagant, but it's very beautiful. And this is in Rome, actually. This is the Trevi Fountain, where I was also in Italy just last year, and had the same experience. So there's something moving about this question of beauty, just in something basic like a balcony that has some extra little thing to it, which gives you, there's a higher degree of freedom in your whole sense of being when you experience this. The way Schiller describes it, and this is really what I want to set down, is that, yeah. Ideal art must abandon reality and elevate itself with sufficient boldness above need, for art is the daughter of freedom, and she receives her rules from the necessity of the spirit, not from the pressing need of matter. But today need rules, and degraded humanity bows down under its tyrannical yoke. Utility is the great idol of the age, to which all powers are supposed to be a slave, and to which all talents pay homage. This question of the slave who performs his duty, a good slave, which is what we basically see everywhere. 95% of people we encounter every day are basically good slaves who do their duty in whatever form it has to be. But number one, they don't usually like it, right? And number two, the question is, well, how could one actually do what one knows is the right thing to do, and actually take joy in doing that, right? Because somebody could do the right thing. We can say the right thing, like, yeah, it's terrible what's happening in Africa. We should totally stop hunger and these things. Yeah, that's true, but what is one actually going to do about it such that we stop the hunger? That's a completely different question. And just by you agreeing that you don't think hunger in Africa is a good thing, it doesn't mean you don't really mean it. You're not really actually doing anything about it. It's a completely passive relationship. And so what do we need? Because we talk to people every day, and people agree with us on the danger of war. They agree with us on the question of the empire, but they're not doing anything. So what is it that these people need? What is it they're missing such that right now they're just being good slaves? And we need to turn them from good slaves into good human beings who love truth, who love actually fighting and upholding for the truth. So with that said, I was going to talk about poetry today. I had all sorts of different selections that I was hoping to use. And then I started reading this wonderful art review on classical Greek sculpture from our Fidelio magazine, our Schiller Institute magazine. And I was completely consumed by this, and I figured I'd change my presentation to talk to you guys about what I saw. So what we're talking about here, we're talking about ancient Greece. And the thing about ancient Greece is you have these Homeric epics where basically there was a dark age in Greece as of 1000 BC, where basically you had just a complete destruction by empire of whatever civilizations had been there. And Homer describes that in great detail in his books. And the point is that if one really wants to understand history and what happened, we have to actually look at what were the ideas that were dominant at these different times, right? And we weren't physically there. So the question is, how do we understand how these cultures actually thought? What was really their idea of a human being, of the universe, frankly? And I give this as the first case study, which is presented here by one of our members on intelligence, Dean Andromedas. And the first one is from 600 BC. It's called the Sunian Kouros. And what you see here at 600 BC, what you're really seeing is the typical imperial idea of man that we're so familiar with today, frankly, where what you're seeing in the sculpture, does anybody have any remarks? If they had to describe the one on the left, what would people say? What comes to mind when you look at that? Just first thoughts that come to mind when you see that. Okay, distorted woman. Well, Franny looks completely dead. It looks completely still. It doesn't look at all like it's moving. So it looks like it's as close as a dead human being as you're going to get, basically. And so the point here is that what you have is really a completely static figure. Everything is completely balanced and still. There's no sign of life or of motion, emotion, nothing. It's just dead. It's just a rock, frankly. It's a stone. So this is from 600 BC, right? And then when you just go a bit further, right, you see the change where this one is the Anavisos Kouros from 530 BC. And the difference here is already you have a bit more definition. It's a bit more lifelike. It actually resembles more the human form, what one would actually think of when they're thinking about a human being. But the point here is that this is exactly what you see embodied in the first one and still hanging on in the second one is this imperial concept of man basically the perfect world for an oligarchy where nothing changes, right? Everybody has their fixed position in society. Everybody has their caste. You have the priesthood, you have the PhD professors, the experts, right? We're in a world of experts today that we have to consult. You have the emperor, you have the financiers, the ruling class, and that doesn't change. Then you have the serfs, you have the average people, which we meet every day, who say there's nothing you can do. So they've accepted their fixed place in society, and they don't even dream of changing that, right? That's the basis of their identity. This is who I am. I won't even fathom changing things. Now, if we go a bit further, right, as history goes on, we start to see a change. We start to see motion within mankind, within humanity. We start to see something awake, right? Where if you compare just this one with the one before, it becomes pretty obvious that this stone, this seeming stone, is actually alive. It's actually moving. You actually see some form of motion in this warrior who's been struck down, right? So this is as the fallen warrior on the pediment of the temple of Aphaea at Aegina 490-480 BC. So the point that Dean Andromedas is making here is in a very short interval of time, you have a complete change in the representation of man, in the idea of man, where you actually have a living idea, where in one moment, the key thing is the artist now has to capture a moment that actually encapsulates a whole idea, that encompasses a whole process. So you have here these Greeks, a Greek soldier at war who's been wounded. And he could be getting up, he's maybe on his last breath, maybe trying to get up one last time to fight. And the thing that Dean points out, though, is everything looks very calm, however. The whole aura, atmosphere, nonetheless, it's in the midst of warfare, but there's a certain serenity to the whole idea. So this is the beginning of actually communicating, transmitting something that is beyond the flesh, beyond just what you can touch, taste, hear, smell, or see, right? An actual idea, which is what, as I'm sure JP developed, right? This is the thing about human beings. We're not just creatures of the flesh, which is what the whole question of the oligarchy is based on, convincing people that they're just animals, right? That we are just of the flesh. There is no truth. There's nothing more that you can aspire to than what you can touch, taste, hear, or smell or see. And so people go through life just feeling their way through, and you run into all sorts of trouble. So the question here is, what is really beautiful, right? Is this beautiful, this first one? Is that beautiful? Is there something called universal truth, universal beauty? Or is it in the eye of the beholder? Is beauty just how you feel, right? I feel like this. This makes me feel good. And that is good for you. That's your truth. That's your beauty. That's what we see today. That's how people actually operate. What's true for them, the decision they make on life, is not whether it's actually true or not. It's, well, this is how I feel. This is what I'd like to do, so I'm going to do it. Who are you to bring into question what I'm going to do with my life? But the real issue is there this thing beyond the literal senses which mankind can actually attain, which is actually the real issue. And this is where the whole battle throughout history has really been, because it's really a battle of the mind. It's really a battle for is man a beast or not? Is there something separate from humanity? And today, this is the whole, if you will, the polemic that I think is important to bring up, is today what most people think is beautiful ultimately what most people think is true, and what their freedom is, what their idea of freedom is actually the thing that enslaves them. Whereas in the past, if you go back to classical Greece, you actually had an idea of universal beauty. You actually had an idea of universal truth. If you go to the Italian Golden Renaissance, there was a very clear, very profound idea of what true beauty was. And you see it everywhere. If you go to Italy, if you go to certain places in France, and so on, and you see what used to be in Greece. And so, I think this is really a wonderful example, because first off, this one is, I've said this before, but when the first time I saw this, really the first question that came to me was, why does this guy look more alive than most people we run into on a day-to-day basis? It really looks alive. But what is it? Because Schiller, the idea that Schiller puts forward is that if art is to actually be, ideal art must abandon reality and elevate itself with sufficient boldness above need. For art is the daughter of freedom, and she receives her rules from the necessity of the spirit, not from the pressing need of matter. How is one, this is the question that strikes me, how do we communicate the idea of a human being with stone? Something completely static, inanimate. How do you actually get across the idea of a living human being who thinks, who loves, who hypothesizes? And so if you see here, this one is called Hermes and Baby Dionysus. And I could have maybe put other angles, but the thing about this is you see the baby seems to be going towards Hermes, looking towards Hermes, reaching out. You know, he's just holding him in his arm, and frankly, the other arm is probably going to give him something or showing him something. But where is the gaze of Hermes aimed, really? Where is he looking?
Is it done on purpose to that the artist cut the arm?
No, it's just from time. But if you look at where he's looking, there's not a direct gaze at the child, actually. Right? He's actually looking past it. And so what Praxiteles here, who's the sculptor who actually who made this, is you actually have the moment of thought, really a moment, if you will, of discovery for a human being, which LaRouche describes as the idea in mid-motion, right? How do you actually capture something that's completely still? How do you capture motion? But even more so, not just motion, how do you capture an idea in something completely inanimate? And so it's by getting exactly that crucial moment where in a series of different acts, you find that point of change where you can actually encompass the whole idea. Now, I'd read this. LaRouche says the relative fault in the mathematical formulation is that when applied according to today's generally accepted classroom traditions, it lacks poetry. It lacks the obligation of the poet to embed a truthfully stated ambiguity in the composition. It fails to compel the mind to capture the image of the idea in mid-motion, the form in which all true ideas exist. Okay. So this is really the demonstration for me, I think that anyone who really experiences something truly beautiful is moved by the fact that it's more than just it's not really what they're looking at. It's not an object, it's not a thing when one is talking about beauty or truth. It's no material object. In fact, it's not what's there at all. It's what's not there. And it's what it's bringing forward from you. Now, if we compare that with this. I just like to, let's just completely change the idea now. Have people ever seen this? Do people know who did this? Huh? Cleopatra?
Yeah.
I did it last week.
Huh? You did? Oh, you did it last week. That's good. It's a Pollock, the famous Pollock. Right? You guys have all heard about him. Yeah, this is called convergence. I don't know if it's from top to bottom, right to left, upside down. I couldn't be sure. Now, what happened? Because before, we actually have these living ideas actually communicating a profound conception about mankind. Now, I asked anybody to explain to me, what the hell is this about? What the hell is this communicating? I'd say it's completely insane. It's insanity. If you had to put insanity something, this is what you have. A case of very acute neurosis. And so I wanted to understand how one thinks, who would paint something like that. Get into the mind of somebody who's going to do something like that. And here's what Harley Hand, some guy I found on the internet who is some self-made millionaire. He sold like 40 books. He's a philosopher, a humorist, an artist, and he does modern art, and he's really passionate about it. And he writes, with the work of the post-impressionists, the purpose of art itself had begun to change. For most of history, the primary purpose of painting had been to portray images rather than to evoke feelings and emotions. Starting with the post-impressionists, however, the emphasis began to shift. For the first time, unconscious feelings began to find their way into mainstream art. What allowed this to happen was that the Impressionists had loosened the bonds, giving permission for painters to stray from their representational roots and become more abstract. The reason that this is so important is that most of human life exists unconsciously, below the surface of perception and beyond the reach of voluntary, purposeful thinking. Within this netherworld lies the strong, untamed, and irrational forces that give life to our being and definition to what it means to be human. Interesting.
So he's saying that
what do people think about that?
We're not aware of, that is what is human. That's what he's saying. All these involuntary things, all these unconscious things that's happening inside us, that's what's human.
Okay.
Bestializing.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts? Do people agree with this? Disagree? What do you think? Well, let me tell you this, Malion. This is how I feel. Okay, so don't question that. Okay, that's what people say today. You have no right to question how I feel. Why are you depressed? Because I'm depressed. Don't tell me how to feel. This is what you get today.
So the schizophrenic who has no idea of, his mind is not consciously controlling himself, is schizophrenic. That's the most human part of him. The sickness he has. So for this man, those unconscious emotions, that's what makes us human. Express it. And he's forgetting all the ability of man to understand nature and to understand moral values and stuff like that. That's what I see as being more human.
But yeah, this is the question, because your idea of beauty, your idea of truth, your idea of what art is fundamentally going to be based on what your idea of a human being is, right? So it's not the object here. Forget what's here. The real question is, what is the idea of man which is actually being represented here? are human beings rational beings, or are we beasts? Are we irrational beasts, right? And we just have an economy, which is the free market, so-called, and everybody has their pleasures, they have their desires, and they want it, and they're going to pay for it. You can bet. And so all of society should just be based on this free market, where you don't have nations that get in the way, you don't have laws, and we're not going to tell other people what to do, this idea of truth, and nobody knows truth, right? Let people get what they want. They're allowed to be free. That's their right. You have no right to tell them, what they're allowed to do and what they're not.
That's a part of life, that's a way of looking at it, but it's not the whole thing of looking at it.
Well, that's why I wanted to...
Feeling is fundamental to human being, but there is a whole range of feelings. And if this is a part of feeling, okay, but I would say it's just a little bit of feeling of the whole range of feelings.
Well, either a human being's rational or it's not, right? And there's nothing really that you...
We are all irrational as much as we are rational.
That's not true. See, that's what I'm saying. That's not true. This is a view that...
A part of me is unconscious,
What is that you?
but
What is that really?
I have to
Or is it your body?
I have to sail between rationality and irrationality.
That's what the slave is. That's what Schiller is saying. The slave is the one who does his duty, right? The good slave is one that says, I don't want to do, you could do the right thing, but you don't really want to do that, right? You'd rather just, go home and crack open a beer or something, right? Isn't that what we all want? But no, no, not at all. The real question is that human beings are not beings of the flesh. That's the whole point, that there's something higher in a human being, and this is what's attacked. This is what the oligarchy attacks and denies. This is the Zeusian principle, right? And what this was funded. See, what people don't know when they start talking about these things is that this whole new modernist, abstractionist movement and all these things were funded by the CIA. These things were funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, by the highest echelons of the financial oligarchy, in order to promote a certain idea of a human being. Where what do we say? We say art is what you feel, right? There is no universal truth. There's no universal beauty that's knowable to the human mind. It's what you feel. Nobody has a right to tell you anything about that, okay? And so let all those irrational feelings below the surface of understanding. That's what makes you really you. And your day job and all that, that's just you when you put on the chains, and you go to work and all that, and then you take them off and you just have your me time, right? That's what we have, a society of slaves, which Aldous Huxley, he called this a concentration camp with no tears, where people like their slavery, and they're going to defend it. They're saying, it's my right, how dare you? And they're getting really pissed off, right? We see this all the time. So this is just a few examples of just blatant insanity. $100 million, Picasso nude green. Who would pay for that? Oh, it gets better. This one is this is like the 4th most expensive painting in the world by William Kooning. Picture of a woman. What's his idea of a woman?
Man, we should go
I'd hate to meet the woman that he's referring to. Right. So that's really the question. The question of reason, the point Schiller is making about this question of aesthetics, about this question of true beauty, is that, I think I have it here, only the morally educated man is truly free. It's where man's desires and duty are actually wed together, are one, that one effortlessly, freely does what he or she knows is right. And that's actually what they take joy in. Right? This is a free human being. Because we are beings of reason. So whether we say we have irrational feelings or not, the question is, you can say, well, why do I have irrational feelings? Right? I don't just have to blindly act on them as if I'm like possessed by a demon or something. And when you do something stupid, you're like, well, that other guy made me do it. Right? You can take responsibility for your actions. So the real issue is that today there's been an attack on what it means to be a human being, And instead, today, this idea of freedom, which is presented here, right, this is the point I want to make, the very idea of freedom, which people think is true freedom, is the thing that makes them captive, is the thing that actually enslaves them. Their idea of freedom is based on the idea of a bestial mankind. And so if you see, I just read this as what LaRouche says on this question of culture in regards to all this. He says the common characteristic of all classical art and its performance lies essentially not with the senses as such, but in the shared imagination of speaker and hearer, in the well-performed classical drama, such as that of Shakespeare. The audience's attention is quickly transported from the vision of the stage to the stage of the audience's imagination, as Shakespeare points out in the opening role of chorus for Henry V. It is the same for the performance of great works of classical music, where composer, performance, and witting audience meet minds together in the common domain of the cognitive powers of imagination. The connection between classical art and classical science, such as that of Plato, Cusa, Kepler, Leibniz, Gauss, has the purpose of joining the cognitive powers of individual members of society together in exertions to a common end, through the training of social relations within society, by aid of composition and performance of classical modes of artistic composition. We are best enabled to muster individual discoveries of those universal physical principles dwelling in the unseen and unheard, into the mission-orientated common purposes of the social process through which mankind conquers external nature. It is by that means that man rises above the beasts and distinguishes himself from the apes. As Schiller says, the dignity of man into your hands is given. Its keeper be, it sinks with you it will be risen. If you sympathize with this idea of man, this irrational being, well, that's why we're in the society that we're in, right? Because no rational human being who can really freely do his duty would allow for the kind of cultural destruction and physical destruction of human life all across the world. It's their concept of a human being, which is actually what's been attacked and degraded to the point that these people never even look up. They keep their face to the ground, right? Their face in the mud, and they never look up. They never question these things. They're slaves, and so they're just going to do their duty. They're responsible. They're responsible adults. So I just finish with this. I just leave with this sculpture that I saw in Italy. This is at the top of the Palazzo Vecchio of the Medici family. It's by Donatello, and it's from the Old Testament, the story of Judith and Holofernes, where the fable is that she's they have this town that is being ransacked by this Assyrian general, and what this peasant widow woman does is he liked her, so she brings him into her house, gets him drunk, and then she decapitates him. And so this is at the top of the Medici tower, and it was originally put in Medici's garden by Donatello, and there's an engraving at the bottom which says, kingdoms fall through luxury, cities rise through virtues, behold the neck of pride severed by the hand of humility. So the idea is of the cause of justice, of truth, right, even on the weaker force, prevails over the lust and power and greed of evil. And so it's really a wonderful metaphor for what was happening in Florence, where these centers of culture, of Renaissance, you'll find it everywhere, the image of man that they had. And that's what was actually the cause for all the great developments that we've seen throughout history. It always gets back to this fundamental question. So that's what I leave it at. This is the question that I wanted to pose, that really what we're in is a battle for the human mind, a battle for what is humanity really. And we'd like everybody to help us and join us with that. To it, which gives you, there's a higher degree of freedom in your whole sense of being when you experience this. The way Schiller describes it, and this is really what I want to set down, is that, yeah. Ideal art must abandon reality and elevate itself with sufficient boldness above need. For art is the daughter of freedom, and she receives her rules from the necessity of the spirit, not from the pressing need of matter. But today need rules, and degraded humanity bows down under its tyrannical yoke. Utility is the great idol of the age, to which all powers are supposed to be a slave, and to which all talents pay homage. This question of the slave who performs his duty. We're going to close the presentation and switching the nature of the discussion to something that I think is crucial right now, given the kind of crisis that we're in. Yes, there's an economic crisis. There's a financial crisis. There's a lot of crises. If you go to Africa, if you go in many different places, there's wars. And there's also an unseen crisis, right? And this is the tendency where people tend to react to what they can see, which they, more often than not, as I'm sure JP may have touched on this, believe is actually the cause of their misère and all the problems, right? Where we have these austerity protests, right? We have these protests against war and all that, which are noble things in themselves. But the question is, how do we actually change in 2012 to work with our organization there for the presidential campaign? Jacques Cheminade in France was our presidential campaign. And one thing that struck me that you don't see here, that people here in North America really have no inkling of, is when you look at some of the architecture, just average houses, just you go down average streets, and it's just beautiful. It's beautiful. It's very beautiful. And there's a certain feeling that I was hit with when you're looking at this and you're just seeing, this is a good example. This is very extravagant, but it's very beautiful. And this is in Rome, actually. This is the Trevi Fountain, where I was also in Italy just last year and had the same experience. So there's something moving about this question of beauty, just in something basic like a balcony that has some extra little thing to do what we need to do, which I think Avneet, JP may have presented in some form. We're going to have to create new institutions based on a new concept of man. And that's actually the issue. What is the conception of a human being which we need right now if we're actually going to shape and make policy, as has always been the purpose and basis of this organization. And so that's why I want to speak to you guys about art. And so here we have a famous passage from Schiller's very epic, great poem, The Artist, where he says, "The dignity of man into your hands is given. Its keeper be. It sinks with you it will be risen." And he's referring to art, that art is really the keeper of man. So I tell a story first. I had the fortune of going to France. The system which creates these problems. Is that even the case? Is there something higher which we should actually be paying attention to, that without that we are actually going to be impotent in the face of all these different crises that are coming at us like a thousand-headed hydra, and people are like, oh my God, it's too complicated, it's too hard, there's nothing you can do. That's not true, but that's why I want to get at a completely unpractical question, like the question that is on virtually nobody's mind right now, that is actually the fundamental question, that if we can actually resolve this in people, we can actually talk about the real problem and solve it. But if you look at the world today, with all the insanity and chaos, the culture, the satanic culture, frankly, we're going to have to create new institutions in order